doing and how he's come upon this way of revising his work.
Sure. Yeah, boy, I wish I got it right at the beginning. I didn't have to rewrite. It rarely works that way. So this is a novel in progress, and I'm doing the final revisions for it. It's a novel called Red Boy, and it deals with witches, among other things. It's a plunge back into the 17th century and early colonial history. And even though I had an ancestor at Salem, it's not a Salem novel. I really didn't want to do another Salem novel. So this is set on the Connecticut coast. I did some of my growing up before Indiana in Connecticut. And I received the edit on this novel from my editor this summer, and I thought everything was looking good. And actually his edit was kind of discreet. He didn't have all that much to say, I thought. And then I read what he had said and looked at what I had written and then read it again and thought, oh no, and really started to go after it. And so I had this printout with his comments in the margins. And I, for years, at a certain point, will do a revision with a pen holder and ink. And I go through, and somehow that collaboration of the handwritten, the ink that's being dipped into, the scratching sound that's made when you run a metal nib over a piece of paper really wakes something up, and I start to see things differently. And I was hoping it would be nice and gentle, but it wasn't. It was brutal, what happened.
It's like your blood on the page, you know, like this is how hard this process can be. I remember when we talked about Neverhome, I think you said you used kind of a pen, an old pen, to do some of that too. So you liked having this harking back to previous times rather than just doing everything on the computer. That seems important to you.
Well, you know, I'm no Luddite, and I do most of my work on a computer, but I'm also really interested in and susceptible to these ancient technologies. I mean, these go way back, and making marks on paper with tools, making marks on clay with tools, and what happens to the imagination when you tap into these older itineraries, older trajectories, so that even if you're working with the latest software, I think it's worth trying this. And my handwriting is really bad too, and that's interesting because often I'll read through what I've put on the page, and I think just this one page seems to be sitting up here. But I have to sort of imagine what I've written as a note. And you know, whenever the imagination rushes in, interesting things are bound to happen. So there's what I've written on the page, and then what's actually gets entered into the final file.
Well, you know, I first saw this on Instagram, and it made me think, you know, your novels are very visual. And I remember at one point we talked, and you said how you like to take photos. You kind of a bit of a shutterbug, you said, and both Evening Road and Neverhome are kind of journey novels that have visual elements. Can you speak to that, about trying to get those visual elements that you love to do as a photographer, but getting that kind of feeling into a novel?
Sure. Yeah, and indeed the novel that goes right before in this quartet that I've been writing, called Kind One, actually has photographs in the book itself. So photographs that I took using a pinhole camera that I took around the family farm in rural Indiana, which is sort of the heart of my imagination, sort of that deep center of my imaginative capacity seems to be rural Indiana, for better or worse. And so I took these pictures, and they were actually really generative for a section of that novel. And at first I thought I would remove the scaffolding, so to speak, of these photographs, but then I realized they'd become part of the integral nature of the text, and I left them in. And Neverhome, then, which I was writing at the same time that I was finishing up Kind One, started with images in the manuscript as well. So I have a manuscript that has images, including some photographs that I took, but also others that I found and altered in different ways. And for a long time, the Evening Road had a picture that I took on the courthouse square in Marion, Indiana, of a tree that sits very near the tree that was used to hang the young men that were hung on August 7th, 1930, that gave rise to first a poem by Abel Meeropol called Bizarre Fruits. It was a Brooklyn-based poet who saw this terrifying picture postcard that was circulating around the United States in the wake of this terrible event. And then he set it to music and actually presented this poem set to music to a producer who said, you know what, I'm going to give this to Billie Holiday. And it became the song Strange Fruit that we know of. But so this event took place in Marion, Indiana, near the family home, and the tree that this occurred, the lynching happened on, has long since fallen down, but there's another tree that's grown up, which I find very haunting. So that was at the start of the manuscript. But I realized it wasn't integral to what followed. It didn't need that image as a kind of gateway. And so as with Neverhome, the images left, but I think they haunt the text, even so.
Yeah, I mean, as you read The Evening Road, which is really a story of a couple journeys. One is of a white woman who is going to the lynching, and another is of a young black woman, really a girl, she's 16, kind of trying to escape, get out of town during the day of the lynching. And it's just very visual. They come across all sorts of characters. You really see what they're seeing. One of them drives, the black woman drives a car, the dictator, which she paints, and it's kind of amazing visual images throughout, which really struck me. The other thing that strikes me about the book, and also Neverhome and Kind Ones, is that you're embodying a female narrator. In this book, it's two main ones, but even the third one who comes in at the end is a woman narrator. So you're telling these historic stories through female narrators. What's driving that, or how are you coming to that?
Yeah, so that's right. All the books in this quartet have women at their center and women who are speaking. This was never a conscious decision I made. I didn't say one day, wow, wouldn't that be interesting to do this? And I know some writers function that way. That's not how I do it. Simply a voice appeared in my head. And it was kind of the voice of my grandmother who raised me in large part on this farm in rural Indiana. And then it was something else as well that had to do with research I'd done and things I was interested in, art I was seeing, and so on and so forth. And so in the case of Kind One, this voice, and I've got this in my notebook, it's in the late 2000s, and it's once I lived in a place where demons dwelled. I was one of them. And this voice presented itself, and I could hear the timbers of it. I knew sort of who it was, but I didn't know enough about it, and so I had to explore it through the form of this novel. And then I thought, okay, wow, I've done that. That's quite interesting. Maybe I'll go on to something else, but then another voice started to speak, and that was Neverhome. And then that happened with The Evening Road. And in all of those cases, I realized with this interest in crucible moments, crucible issues in American history, right? So the Jim Crow experience in the United States, the Civil War and pre-Civil War slavery, that it simply wouldn't do to have one voice speaking in the text. It had to be a space of multiplicity, and so other voices started to propose themselves and speak. In the case of Kind One, it's not all women who are speaking, but in Neverhome, there is this central narrator who's female, and then in The Evening Road, there are two.
So the book begins with the white woman who is trying to get to the lynching, Addie Lee. She's a married woman, but she's got a lecherous boss, and her boss says, hey, we're taking the day off, we're gonna go to this lynching. And for a while, you don't, as a reader, you feel like she's just going along. Because as the reader, you want to feel like you're in the head of somebody who's not so terrible. But eventually, you do come to realize that Addie Lee does have agency, that she could not go along. Tell us about that character and this idea of where is that boundary between you're going along with something that's not good and when you're really participating? Sure.
So the novel gets started for me. The idea for the novel came in conjunction with hearing a radio story, and it was called. It was on NPR, and it was originally a show on Radio Times. And it was called "Strange Fruit: Anniversary of a Lynching." And I'm driving along listening to this, and it was quite a beautifully produced piece with recorded testimony from people who had been there on that day, on August 7th, 1930, the actual lynching that inspires the one that occurs in my book. And one of them was James Cameron, who was supposed to be the third person lynched. James Cameron was an extraordinary individual. He was a kid. He was 16. And the crowd, the mob, suddenly all the energy went out of it, and he was allowed to live, but he was dragged to the tree. He's speaking about his experience that day. He lived to a ripe old age. And then also there are voices of people who went to see this event. And one of them in particular, she is not named, but she really struck me. And she talks about, indeed, someone, a friend, a boss, a colleague says, grab your things, we're going to go off, there's going to be a lynching. So this lynching was signaled. It was, the word went out as far as Chicago. This is central Indiana. So we're talking hundreds of miles away. As the estimates went, some 10,000 people went to see this event. And so she's describing this. And then what she says, and that was sort of interesting to me, but what she says a little bit later was really intense. She says, I wished 1,000 times I hadn't been so inquisitive. That's what she said. And she doesn't say, I shouldn't have gone, this was a terrible thing. She says, I wished I hadn't been so inquisitive. And there was something about the ambiguity of that proclamation. This is a woman many years later talking about this. She's being interviewed in a nursing home, as a matter of fact. And that struck me, and that's the kind of ambiguous space that gets my imagination fired, gets my curiosity, my own curiosity sparked, for better or worse. And it was very much the case in Kind One, with this individual who is complicit in the institution of slavery and in some ways a victim of it herself. And Never Home, that starts I was strong, he was not, so it was me went to war to defend the Republic. So there's an ambiguity at the center of the proposition. And then in the case of The Evening Road, this person who was going along, and right at the start of the novel, you think, okay, it's her boss, she kind of has to go along to this thing. But you realize that, in fact, there's a growing sense of her power within the situation. And that she, like so many people, is shuttling back and forth along some kind of spectrum, right? And so this, this is not a novel about, right, in the first half we are presented with the bad person, and in the second half we're presented with the good person, nor is it meant to create some terrain of false equivalency between the two situations, the one who's going and the one trying to escape. But it does, I hope, strongly assert that there is a deep humanity inherent in anyone in these situations. And in some cases, absolutely awful what people are doing. But it doesn't make them into monsters, it seems to me. It's certainly not within the range where Audie Lee is working on that particular day.
Well, I was hoping you could read just a passage from Audie Lee's section. And it just kind of sets up a lot of things. This happens towards the beginning of the book, because one of the things Laird likes to do, at least in the last few books, is there aren't very many straight lines. And so this is where Audie Lee realizes that they're not really on a straight line during this day.
So we're near the start of the novel. I thought the great big bright idea was to head straight off to Marvel, but Bud got stopped by some of the boys who worked in the print shop down the hall, and they had to colloquize a while about how it was going to be the biggest thing anybody ever saw. One of the boys, Charlie Goodwin, who Bud Lancer had gone to school with and who hated Bud and who Bud hated right back, claimed to have been to a lynching when he was making a delivery down to Kentucky, but they all said they didn't believe him. He said whether they all believed him or not, wasn't any concern of his because it was true. They had hung a cornflower janitor right from a saloon sign, hadn't cut him down for a week. Folks down in this Kentucky town Charlie said he couldn't remember the name of had set card tables out in the street, and there had been a turkey banquet right there under the show. After the turkey was served, a little girl sang Dixie and juggled 5 blue balls. Then when the juggling was done, they squirted the dead man with fuel oil and set him alight. Dinner right there under a dead man and a fire show on top of it, Bud Lancer said. Did you hear that, Audie? Then, of course, the boys had to chuckle on a while about that dinner, and even if I didn't think it was funny, I chuckled along with them. Bud liked my way of chuckling. He always said that, and the way I could fill out a shirt that wasn't even snug was what had got me my job.
So there's so much going on that's setting up at the beginning of the book there, this tradition of lynchings, this is a social scene, the sexism of the boss is right there. It's all, so much is early in the book. One thing, though, that is interesting and plays a part in the book is you use the word cornflower there. And the words cornflower, corn silk, corn root, to stand in for black, white, or Native American. And it's an interesting decision on your part, and I wonder if you could speak to that, because you use those words instead of what would have been used at the time. Kind of gives the novel a gloss, like maybe we're not exactly historically there in some strange way.
Yeah, so a few things come to mind about that. So there is this switched out terminology that's used throughout the book, and it came fairly early in the writing process and stayed with it. And I was thinking as I listened yesterday to Omar El-Akkad, who was talking about on a panel his novel An American War, which posits a civil war in the United States in 2074. So it's a piece of speculative fiction. And his sense when he was writing it, because of course you're writing these things years behind these events that bloom up and change and distort everything. So he's writing this book well before the election of Donald Trump, and he thinks in many ways he's writing a book about environmental devastation and climate change run amok. But the election of Donald Trump turns the conversation about the book into something else, which is about American dystopia and North-South, red-blue state divides, that sort of thing. And how, it's fascinating just sort of shaking his head and also, being aware that can happen. And I think about this question of cornflower, corn silk, and have wondered to myself at times, right? So the idea is to trouble this notion of terminology, right? To problematize this notion of terminology. So the slurs that were in use at the time, it's very clear what they're standing in for, right? So you look at it and you know what would be said in this place. And so it's was never meant to be some sort of dodge of difficulty, right? To sort of smooth over the edges of things and make it all seem a little bit nicer. But it was fascinating to me that really, so rather than the question of these women and the complexity of their itinerary, et cetera, oftentimes that was the question. What are you doing with that? Are you trying to paint over difficulties in the past? Sort of who are you to do this and play fast and loose with history in this way? And so it was really an intriguing moment for me as a writer to think about this and wondering, well, what would the conversation have been if Hillary Clinton had in fact been elected? And that's a very petty way to look at things, but just in the way it's instructive to think about the way the world impacts us in all sorts of different ways. It was fascinating.
Well, I think if you want to go the easy route about history, you probably don't write about a lynching, right?
I would have thought. Yeah.
It seems like you're taking on some things. Well, it's interesting you talk about the other book where the Civil War in 2074 and how the Trump election kind of changes how that book is viewed. You started writing this book probably a year or two, if I had to guess, before we had this very highly publicized spate of killing of young men, black men, by police officers. And somehow, I think that maybe changed the world that your book came into, perhaps from when you started it. Did you feel that way, or?
Sure. And those events, I was recently in conversation in Edinburgh in Scotland with Colson Whitehead, and this question came. So we were talking about race in America. That was the subject of our conversation, and the moderator put the question to us about cultural appropriation, about these extrajudicial killings of young black men, and Colson said, he was writing, and how did that affect the Underground Railroad, which is a book some of you will know that he wrote that won the Pulitzer Prize and many other awards. And he said, this is not news to me, the fact that young black men are being killed by police officers. It's just being publicized. So it did not affect the way that he thought about writing that book. And in the case of The Evening Road, I can't say whether or not it would have affected it, because indeed the book was written in many ways before this really came to public prominence, this particular issue. But these books, Kind One, Never Home, The Evening Road, and Red Boy, are all in many ways about these subjects, right? The past feels absolutely, deeply, entrenchably, resolutely present. So many of these things that are playing out are absolutely an extension of what was playing out in the 1860s and for the hundreds of years before that. And so shock and dismay is the way I think about these things.
Mm-hmm. I mean, is this issue seems to be the central key issue of our times, and as a novelist, do you feel that you really need to find a way to address that, or is it just because it's such a central issue you find yourself just addressing it naturally?
Well, again, so these things, there hasn't been that sense of, I don't think of it ahead of time, so it's not programmatic in a way. These ideas, these voices come to me and I attend to them. And there's some voices that come to me and I'm like, oh, I can't do anything, sorry. I'm not going to be able to help.
What's a voice that you can't do anything with?
Oh gosh, all those voices that, for those books I thought I was going to write in my 20s, and like, is it time yet? Are we going to do it? No, I don't think it's going to happen, young man. But in this context of challenging subject matter, and who gets to turn it into a painting, who gets to turn it into a film, who gets to turn it into a novel. These questions are being raised constantly. I was just on a panel, right, where this was the subject of the day on cultural appropriation, who gets to write what. And so of course, being a person in the world and thinking about these things and valuing this conversation deeply, I've paid a lot of attention to this conversation and been embroiled in it in certain ways. And I came to a quote by Barry Jenkins, the director of Moonlight, a film that I think a number of you will have seen, that won the Academy Award, although for a moment it didn't seem like it had, etc., if you remember the drama at the Oscars. Extraordinary film. And Barry Jenkins is being interviewed, I think just before the Oscars, about the movie. And the interviewer puts to him the question, well, as someone who is straight, Barry Jenkins is straight, did you think that you were the right person to tell this story? Did you think about this? And Barry Jenkins says, of course I thought about it. And then he says, but if I had looked at this material and felt my heart pound the way it was pounding and then turned away, I would have been a coward. Right? So he doesn't say, well, I'm also black and I also grew up in this. He says, he talks about this particular piece of it. And he says that despite that, I felt like I had to do it. And that's been useful to me as well. In thinking about it, right, it doesn't say, okay, great, Barry Jenkins said that, so I'm off the hook, I can do whatever I want. It doesn't work that way, and I don't believe that. But it was useful to me in thinking about some of these challenging issues. And being in that same conversation with Colson Whitehead, when the cultural appropriation question was put to both of us, his novel narrates the story of a woman, Cora, and her escape from a slave plantation. And he pounded his legs and said that writers need to be able to write what they have to write about. If they get it wrong, then they try harder next time. They're not shamed and shunned, etc., for doing this, but they have to try harder next time. And to me, that also helped slot into my mind, okay, this is useful. Maybe I've gotten something wrong. Probably I've gotten something wrong. I'm always failing. But I have to try harder.
Well, it seems like you keep upping the bar a little bit. Like you're writing historical fiction, so you're trying to get back into that time period. You're writing from the voice of a woman. And then the second half of this book, you're writing from the voice of an African-American woman. So there seems to be, you've got a lot of bars you're trying to hurdle over and to create an authentic voice. Do you think about that any differently at this point in your career and with this political environment than you did maybe 15 years ago?
Well, so for many years I wouldn't have touched any of this kind of thing. I wouldn't have swerved out of my lane at all. And yet, you know, as you said, thinking about American history, American stories, having been principally raised by this fierce 4'9" individual, my grandmother, who in many ways was silenced, whose stories weren't told, and having that in my, not that I was going to rectify that and I was going to be the voice for my grandma, you know, that sort of thing, not at all, but it just felt like, where, you know, what is it? What work should one be doing now, whoever one is? And for me, the answer was, you know, diving into these, you know, these situations, these voices that are occurring in my mind. And really the difference isn't so much the 15-year versus now marker. It's the, Kind One came out in 2012, and it came out, and the conversation was entirely different. And that's fascinating to me, right? So when I would go out, I kept expecting to have the conversation about, you know, who are you to write from this point of view, from point of view of a woman, et cetera. And I did have that question, but it was never a, you know, how dare you? It was a sort of, how did you do it? And, you know, because this, you know, this rings true to me. This works for me. For others, it didn't. But it wasn't a, you know, you shouldn't do this. And indeed, the book went on to win a prize for racial tolerance and diversity, the Annis Wolf Award. Henry Louis Gates was the guy who called me up to tell me this. And so just thinking about how the world has shifted since that moment. And I think the conversations we're having now are extraordinarily useful and necessary. And if, you know, my books start to seem, are viewed a little bit differently, fine. That, you know, in the larger scheme of things, it means nothing. Does it affect me personally? Certainly. But it's so fascinating, this great wide world and the kinds of things that are happening and the different kinds of voices that are getting to speak. I'm all for it. It's essential.
Yeah, well, I, for one, am happy you're not writing about Indiana football, you know, if you had stayed in your... So, I want to talk about the element of a journey. You know, your books are really about journeys. In this book, you've got two journeys going, because, you know, like I said, one towards the lynching and the one's away from the lynching. And by the way, neither one gets, well, you never see the lynching. You don't get to the lynching in the book. So the book really ultimately is about those journeys. That is what the book is. The lynching is always in your mind. You can't help but visualize it in your head, but you don't do it on the page. So you're really writing a journey book, which is what Never Home was too.
Yeah, people in motion, people moving. And moving forward and getting knocked to the side, getting knocked backwards, but then continuing to move forward. All of these books have that in common. And that along with that proposition that no matter how fast you walk, no matter how far you walk, there you still are, right? And all that comes with that. So, you know, for me, the idea of writing about history and thinking about these particular individuals who are moving through their own moments in history is about motion and things that are happening to them in many ways because of that motion, because of stepping forward. Right? This notion of leaning in. Well, people have been walking forward for a very long time through dangerous landscapes. I'm highly aware of what it means to set a young woman in motion through a landscape in 1857, right? I understand that the dangers of that proposition. You know, one could say this same thing about 2017, right? So these are things that, you know, that have carried on with us. But so what does it mean to be a human being and then to have these extra dangers, these extra tensions? A young woman in the Civil War who goes to fight in disguise, which is the proposition of Never Home. She has to do absolutely everything those young men she's bunking with have to do, and then she also has to protect her identity. Because to be discovered means that you are kicked out, you are humiliated, you are ridiculed, perhaps you're called a spy and executed, all of these things. So just what does it mean, putting these human beings into these situations? And it always seems to go hand in hand with this journey. And yeah, the journey's never straight. There's a lot of the odyssey in the mix in all of these.
Can you talk a little bit about Cala Destry's journey? She's the black woman, the 16-year-old, who's trying to get away from the lynching, even though she's trying in a strange way, because she ends up right at the courthouse as the mob is forming, and rather than turn and run as fast as she can, she's got an errand, so to speak, that she needs to do. So maybe talk about that journey and what does she see, and what does that mean?
You know, she is a young person, and it's not just coincidental that she's the same age as James Cameron, who I mentioned before, who was 16 years old on that night. And so she has certain impulses that are moving her as quickly as possible out of this town, as so many people in the community of color did. They got out of town or they bolted their doors on that night. So talking about the actual history. And so she has all of that impulse, but she's also been abandoned. Her family is not there, right? So the family, she's being fostered, and they have already left. They're gone. And she finds herself, she stayed a little bit too long waiting for someone to arrive, and she starts to be aware of what's happening, what's swirling, right? So it wasn't as if there was an internet where you got alerts that said, you know, get out of town. Things happen gradually, and so she comes into this awareness of what's going on. I'm going to get out of town is the first idea when she starts to think clearly. And then somehow her internal sense of what she wants to do comes into collision with what she should do. And so she's in possession of a 1930 or 1928 Studebaker Dictator. Studebaker was an Indiana car company, and she's driving it, and she finds herself, instead of going straight out of town, somehow being drawn towards this horrible thing that's going to happen many hours later in the day. And so that will impact what her day is like. So she creates these issues, and it comes out of this sense of this person who is caught between what should be done and what she wants to do, and that seemed very important for this character. But yeah, it makes for a very swerving journey, and if you know the Indiana landscape, or in central Indiana, much of it is a grid. So to move over in any direction, you have to zigzag, and so that was part of the interesting part of what intrigued me about the research was just driving those roads and the grids around Marion, Indiana, and Kokomo, and on down towards Indianapolis, if you know that part of the world.
You grew up near there, about an hour from where the lynching took place. You went back there to do some research, probably, right? You drove around those roads. Did you see anything different, or anything that you wouldn't have expected from you when you were a child? Like, did the feeling of being there now different than when you were a kid?
Well, part of what initially got me interested, that I told you about that voice of that woman and the ambiguity of what she was saying about that experience and having lived through it. The other thing that got me was that I had never heard about the lynching in Marion, Indiana. All those years I lived there. I went to basketball games to go see. They had the best team in the area. We would go and look in awe at these basketball players in Marion, Indiana. Never was this mentioned. And it wasn't mentioned at home by my grandmother. It wasn't mentioned by my family, and it wasn't mentioned at school either. And so that was something I wanted to know. I wanted to see why has this history been erased, right? It's the story that's American history writ large is stories of erasure. And to the extent that, I did go back quite a number of times and spent time in Marion, and a couple of intriguing things. First, the one that speaks to erasure. There was an African-American community called Weaver. It was a small town, fully functional with a thriving community. And in the wake of the events of that lynching, and this had started before, but this completely accelerated, Weaver completely emptied out, to the extent that it's now simply a crossroads with fields and a sign that says this is where Weaver was. So that kind of erasure, right? This sort of just erasure of the physical erasure and the erasure of the stories. On the courthouse square in Marion, there is no mention of this lynching that became internationally famous, again, because of Billie Holiday. There's no mention anywhere. There are lots of memorials and things, but there's no memorial there. And then the other thing that was really something was the jail where these young men were held beforehand is still stands in Marion. It's a very odd structure. It's huge, looks like a medieval castle, and there are turrets with gargoyles. And this was the jail where the mob broke in and took these young men out and killed them, and murdered them. And on my last trip to Marion, I decided, as I had learned before going there, I'd always sort of driven by it a little bit of a distance, I'd learned it had been turned into condominiums in the 1980s. Unbelievable, right? It's still the same structure, looks like a castle, and I decided I had to go in. And so I found my way in, let's say. It wasn't like I could just walk in the front door, but I found my way in through an open side door, and all of the bars between the different areas of the prison are still there, the tile floors, and all of these traces of what it had been are still there. And then there was this, I could hear tinny music coming out of one apartment, and I could smell the cigarettes coming out of another. But at any rate, so I was able to enter into this haunted space and spend time there, which is incidentally a place where Cala in the novel doesn't actually go except in her imagination, right? Because she actually does get to leave town and she doesn't see the lynching, but she imagines it from what she's heard later on. And going myself and putting myself in that space helped me with that process for the character.
Well, you're a writing professor, so I have a writing professor question for you. Yesterday I interviewed Akhil Sharma, and you're writing in first person. You're writing with I, all the time. And so I asked him, what's to be gained from writing that way, and because he had a short story that was in third person, but then the novel based on the short story was first person. I asked, why did you make that change? He said third person, when you're writing he or she, consumes plot at a very fast pace. And the I, it slows it down. You don't consume plot at the same pace. So I was wondering what you thought about that, and does that come into play when you're writing at all, or just your ideas on that observation he made, and that you write in first person, really, these last several novels?
Yeah. And so a couple things come to mind around the first person question, and maybe it goes back around to some of that earlier conversation about who gets to write what and so on and so forth. And for me, it's always been very important that there was it was always very clear who the writer was behind this book. If someone chose to take a look at my photograph, it's right there in the book, right? So there's no sense of a falsification around this, right? I'm not pretending I am these characters. I am pretending them into existence, I suppose. And so something about telling it in the first person made it very clear, made it emphatically clear. There's such a disjunct between me and these voices speaking, and that seemed important. And then thinking about this idea of perspective, whether it's first person or third person, and the way that it can swallow event. And for me, what has always been the gain in the book, and throughout the revision process, some of that rewriting that I've been doing, is finding deeper folds, deeper layers, deeper textures of that consciousness that's speaking, right? So it hasn't been about the plot, so to speak. In each of the cases, with Kind One, with Never Home, with The Evening Road, and now with Red Boy, I have had beginning, middle, and end in a first burst of writing. Right? So I have known more or less where we're headed. And then it's not so much about the physical movement there, although that's part of it as well, but it's the interior movement and what happens in the mind of the character. And first person is amazing for that, getting into the mind of that character, speaking, thinking, turning things over, being preoccupied, being distracted. Right? I'm just talking about the human condition. That's just sort of all of us, right, at all times. And so the idea for me in this case of switching it to a third person, which I've been told at times is, that it's more okay if you do something from a perspective that is not your own. If you put it in third person, somehow that's more okay. I'm not so sure about that, but there would have been a loss of that interiority that's so central to these voices.
Well, it sounds, in some ways, that you're coming at it from the opposite side that he did in a way, but the fact that you're using first person to really get at these folds and this interior life does slow down the outward plot to some extent. Where if you're in third person, you got to keep things moving because you don't have quite that same choice to go inside as deeply, usually.
Oh, no, no, I think that's right. And, you know, it was never more clear to me than with the case of Neverhome, this novel about this woman who goes in disguise to fight during the American Civil War. There were 400 or 500 women who actually did this. And it was that sense of what is it like for a mind and a body to be in this experience? That's what was interesting to me. And it wasn't so much about, I did this extraordinary thing in my youth and now I'm going to tell you this story about it. It's more, what did it feel like? And what are the echoes of it and how haunted is this character? And it became very clear to me, and it created a kind of bubble around it. So I didn't have to write a story about what General Grant was wearing on this particular day and what kind of munitions were on the field at this particular moment. It became about this experience of this consciousness moving through this circumstance that was impossible, in many ways incomprehensible.
All right, I think we're time to open it up for questions at this point. So if anybody's got a question they'd like to ask Laird about the books or about writing or whatever you would like to ask, we're ready to answer the questions. Do we have a microphone that's going to come around? Or yeah, there's a microphone in the back, so let's see if we can. We've got a question in the back. Great.
I'll go to you after, Jack.
Yeah.
Hi. I wondered, as you began talking about being raised by your grandmother and about the experience of being a young boy with a female consciousness, kind of writ large, over your life. And so I wondered, if that's accurate, if there's any accuracy in there. I hope there's a little accuracy in what I'm asking. But so I wonder what, after having spent so much time with these different female consciousnesses, through your characters, through your female protagonists, what you learned about that experience, what you learned about your grandmother, what you learned about the relationship with kind of a feminine consciousness.
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, in many ways, I suppose it's been a way to speak to lack, to Brigitte Gulf. So when that indispensable person leaves, and you didn't realize at the time just quite how indispensable that person was. So we battled quite frequently. I was 13 when I went to live with her in this farmhouse in rural Indiana. And it has been a sort of lifetime's work to realize how central that person was. Within that notion of coming to that understanding was coming to a deeper understanding of who she was and what life meant to her. And when she talked about wishing she had been a little bit taller, she wasn't just saying she wished she could reach the box of oatmeal on the top shelf instead of asking me. She meant something else about the world. That story that she told over and over again so that I would groan about having to raise chickens so that she could go to college during the Depression, right? That kind of story, I hear it again with the light of looking back at it. And thinking about what it meant to be a person and a woman in this world. She was divorced and lived alone in this farmhouse from my grandfather, and so there was an element within that community of shame that she was confronting as well. And so many struggles that she overcame and did it often. Her name was, her name at birth was Fairy Bernard. I think it's gorgeous. But in the 1970s, she became so heckled and ridiculed for this, for the most prurient reasons, she changed her name. Right? So what does it mean to change your name from Fairy to Helen? She took her middle name. All kinds of things. And I go into those details just to say that the complexity has revealed itself about this person to me as I have written these novels. And it's been a happy side effect.
Okay, any questions? Do you have a question up front here? Yeah.
I can also speak fairly loudly.
I think it's coming. It'll get there.
Thank you. I thought the New York Times review of the current book was unfair, but it concentrated not really on the narrative or the story, but on the fact that you had avoided using Negro, etc., how do you feel about that criticism? Was it something that your editors brought up to you and you then made a conscious effort, a conscious decision to do that? Because you haven't shrunk away from using both the African American term and the euphemisms, etc., in other books.
Yeah, so that's right. I was critiqued for that, and you know it's a shame. It's the New York Times, but you know the assignment was made to someone who was pretty clear about where she stood about these particular issues. And you know, as I said right afterwards, I tweeted. So I am involved in social media. I said, you know, this is the way it works. You write the work, and then others get to critique it. So fair enough, and it seemed to me also that if someone takes the time to review your work and think about it, even if it's not what you would have hoped for, there's an act of generosity within that, right? There's an engagement, and so it was too bad, but I will say that I was hoping for this conversation. Right? So I was hoping for people to say, well, why did you use cornflower and corn? You know, what's going on with this? And why should you be able to write about these things? And all of that. But in the wake of this election, so going back to that, the effect was so muted, right? It was just sort of like, we don't even want to talk about this with you. That when that came up, I sort of wished that then there could be a little bit of something, but there was nothing. It was just sort of, that came out. You shouldn't have done that. If you're going to be who you are and write about these subjects, you have to use specific terminology. You cannot do anything that's in any way fanciful. And it decontextualized the novel, which is part of this grouping of books. And no, reviewer doesn't have to know that. But I have been using these approaches and techniques in different ways, not cornflower, corn silk, but the fantastical, the strange, fever dreams, right? The fever dream of remembering intense events. Throughout all of these books. And so it did, you know, that part of it was a little hard for me because it seemed as if I had never thought about any of these things as far as the reviewer was concerned. So on the one hand, absolutely, you put it out there, people get to have that conversation. I would like more conversation rather than less in a way.
What about the editors?
You know, we all thought that this was really interesting, and in fact, the early reviews of the book, this cornflower, corn silk decision, that was focused on, but in a very positive way, how interesting this is. And those were all pre-November. And then when it started, when we hit the Brave New World, the conversation was necessarily different, and I get that. And so they had not said to me, oh, you can't do this. You know, don't do this. Please don't do this. They were all really excited about it, as indeed were many people. And my readers of color as well as white readers. But things shifted. And again, the world changes. It's the way it goes.
I liked it because cornflower, corn silk, you know, the word corn is in there. And I think we talked about this when I interviewed you earlier, that yes, people are different, but underlying, we're all people. So we're all corn. And so the corn comes in. I think at one point you used the term corn cobs. I think they're going to a dance and they say, look at all those corn cobs dancing. So I think it was important that, especially in a book about a lynching, where it's all about the other, we're just going to kill these people because they're different than us and not give them a chance to have a unifying set of words like that, I thought was pretty powerful.
Well, it was also deeply embedded in that landscape, the landscape of rural Indiana. And I was a detasseler, and I spent time in cornfields. And the people detasseling next to me did not necessarily look like me, right? I mean, that we were in this field, and not to get too reductive about it, but then, you know, cornflowers are everywhere. It's a different species, although that was not brought up. And yet there is this underlying, the root of the words, the connection of the words. And so for me that was really essential, but that wasn't what was talked about. It was just, it became easy, you know, for certain people it was low-hanging fruit in terms of, right, you can make quips about painting over difference and so on and so forth. And I get that. You think, dang it, if only I hadn't done that, you know, used color terminology, it could have been something else.
Do you have any other questions? Oh, right. Hand the mic over.
Could you talk a little bit more about grid? Because you mentioned it just now, and I remember now, when I read this book, there was the map. And the intersecting lines. Would you just talk about that a bit without giving away too much to those who haven't read it?
Yeah, sure. So I moved from London, England, to rural Indiana when I was 13, and going from that extraordinarily windy place to the flatlands of central Indiana, which are arranged into these 1 mile by 1 mile grids, and it's broken, right? So there are the constraint has a ripple that runs through it, but by and large that's the case. And so that idea, I had never had in my mind where the sun rises, the sun sets, all of these things. So these fundamental elemental things started to become a part of the way I engaged with the world. And my grandmother was very proud of the fact that she could point to her east woods and then trace the arc of the sun into her west woods, so to speak, over the course of the day. And to this day, I'm very proud of my ability to know which direction we're facing and that sort of thing. But then this notion, there is a map that occurs that is sort of a key motif in the Evening Road. And the map is a little unusual because the people who encounter it, Audley in the first instance and Cala, aren't quite sure what it is and what it's for. It's an unusual map, a map that has other priorities besides the cardinal directions and where roads are. And it's another attempt to reposition the notion of what's essential, what's elemental, what's fundamental within the within the psyche of the person who makes the map, who's a character within the novel. The map is something that moves between both halves of the book. It appears and has a different meaning for each half of the book. It plays a different part, and that seems important too. And these are basic things. Maps, directions, written testimonies don't mean the same thing to everyone. They mean different things to different people.
Okay, we have any more questions? We have somebody back there.
I wanted to ask, it's a very different thing when you write to research and to write than it is to talk, which you're very good about talking about your thing too, but not everyone could do that could write. And then another thing is to market and to try to sell. And so I'm trying to figure out how much does the trying to sell part play into what you pick and what you do? Do you have the freedom to choose the subject yourself and do what you want, or do you have to pay attention?
Sure, yeah. So I do have the freedom to choose the subjects I want to, and hopefully I've expressed that they're sort of choosing me in some way. And then for years I was published by an independent publisher called Coffee House Press, and money has never been a factor within the equation for me. Doesn't mean that I haven't wanted readers and haven't thought about that, but I have gone, sort of stepped forward with these ideas of, this is the thing that I have to write. And then afterwards, let's see what we can do with this shambles that I've created in terms of getting it out into the world. It has always, for me, been an incremental process, right? So I started out by self-publishing a staple-bound magazine that put into print writers I loved, and started a conversation. And then the conversation grew into a relationship with Coffee House Press, where my teachers at Naropa University had been published. And from book to book, it has grown. And this sense of maybe who out there is reading the books has grown. And my hope, right, is that it continues to move, but I've never been so interested in the great leap. It's just in doing the long work, the long, hard work. And we'll see where it goes.
All right, I think that's time. So Laird will be signing books out in the lobby here. And thanks everybody for coming. Really appreciate it.